How much trauma can a person carry before it breaks them, before their past starts writing their present? And when that damage affects the lives of others, where do we draw the line between cause and responsibility? She called herself a survivor, but the world would come to know her as something else. America's first female serial killer, Aileen Wuornos. Charlize Theron portrayed her in the 2003 film Monster, a performance so haunting it won her an Academy Award and permanently shaped how the public remembers the case. But behind the Hollywood headlines was a life marked by instability. Aileen was born into chaos, abandoned by her parents, abused from an early age, and thrown into the streets before she turned 15. For her, every day was a fight for survival, and it meant drifting from highway to highway, truck stops, strangers, and cheap motel rooms across Florida. Then, in 1989, that spiral turned deadly. 7 men shot at point-blank range, and a manhunt that would turn a broken woman into a national media spectacle. But beneath the mugshots, police footage, endless interviews, and courtroom sound bites, a deeper question remains. Was Aileen Wuornos a cold-blooded killer, or the product of a lifetime of violence, exploitation, and neglect? And was she finally fighting back, or just lashing out? Welcome to Deep, Dark, and Scary. My name is Jenny, and today we're diving into the case of Aileen Wuornos, a story that isn't just about murder, but about what happens when a lifetime of pain and survival finally reaches its breaking point. If you enjoy true crime deep dives like this one, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next upload. This content may be disturbing to some viewers. Interstate 75 cuts straight through central Florida, a highway packed with tourists on their way to the beaches, the theme parks, and dream vacations. But for one woman, that highway wasn't a path to paradise. For Aileen Wuornos, it wasn't a choice. It was pure survival. She was just 16 when she first drifted down to Daytona Beach. A runaway, a drifter, living off what she could, doing whatever it took to get by. The I-75 became a hunting ground, a lifeline, and also her escape route. Working as an adult worker, she hitched rides from exit to exit, claiming later that she'd been with thousands of men over the years. Then, between 1989 and 1999, that stretch of highway turned deadly. The FBI called her America's first serial killer. And suddenly, the woman once invisible on the roadside became a national obsession. Before the arrest, police were hunting for 2 women. The press dubbed them the angels of death. Serial killings had already scarred Florida. First Ted Bundy in the late 70s, then the Gainesville Ripper in 1990. Now another wave of killings. 8 men shot to death along the same central Florida highways. It began with a discovery no one could forget. 2 children were out riding their bikes when they saw something strange near the trees. At first, they thought it was a mannequin. Something, if you're into true crime, you surely have heard before. So, you know, it wasn't that, but a body. That body was Charles Dick Humphreys, a retired Air Force major and state child abuse investigator. His pockets were turned inside out, and he'd been shot multiple times. One round fired so close to his head, it left burns on his skin. For the officers on the scene, this one hit close to home. He was one of their own. But Humphreys wasn't the first. Months earlier, an abandoned car had been found on I-75, a blue truck with a flat tire. When police ran the plates, it came back to David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker who had gone missing after leaving work. Days later, his naked body was found in the woods of Citrus County, shot 6 times with a .22 caliber revolver. Soon after that, another car was discovered, this time belonging to Charles Cascaden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker. He was returning from St. Louis to Florida when he vanished. His body was later found in Pasco County, riddled with 9 bullets. Aileen had emptied the gun on him. His belongings were later traced to a pawn shop in Daytona Beach. Then came Troy Boras, a sausage delivery driver from Ocala. He never made it home from his usual delivery route. His truck was found abandoned in the Ocala National Forest, and days later, a couple out for a picnic found him in a decomposing state nearby. He'd been shot twice at point-blank range, still wearing his work shirt, the one embroidered Gilchrist sausage. There was also Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old who owned an electronics repair shop from Clearwater, the first known victim. His body was found in Volusia County, shot 4 times in the chest and head. Mallory's past, including a sexual assault conviction years earlier, would later complicate everything, because it was this killing Aileen first described as self-defense. Then there was Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary from Jupiter, Florida. He'd been driving north to visit family when his car was found crashed in Orange Springs. But this time there were witnesses. They saw two women walking away from the wreck, and those eyewitness sketches would later break the entire case open. But Peter's body was never found. The final known victim was Walter Gino Antonio, a 62-year-old trucker and part-time reserve deputy sheriff. His naked body was discovered in Dixie County, shot 4 times. His flashlight and handcuffs were missing, likely taken as trophies. Each crime scene told the same story. A man traveling alone, shot multiple times, the vehicle abandoned and wiped clean, license plates removed, and the driver's seat pushed forward, as if the killer was much smaller. And with each killing, Aileen's violence escalated. The number of gunshots increased, her control unraveled, and the rage behind the attacks grew more personal. At first, the murders seemed random. Different counties, different victims, different jurisdictions. But slowly, Florida law enforcement began to see the pattern. The same method of dumping the bodies, the same details, missing license plates, wiped down interiors. Detectives from multiple counties formed a joint task force. The .22 caliber revolver, a lighter gun, the seat position, and finally the eyewitness sketches from Peter Seams' crash. It was then that they realized they were looking for a woman, a female serial killer. When we think of serial killers, most of us just picture men, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and that's not just cultural bias. Statistically, it's grounded in fact. Roughly 9 out of 10 known serial killers are men. According to FBI data and criminological studies, men make up about 85 to 92% of all serial killers, depending on the data set. But that doesn't mean women don't kill at all. They surely kill way less, but they also do it differently than men. Female serial killers exist, but their methods are quieter, slower, and often go unnoticed for many years. Unlike Aileen and the male counterparts, who often kill with brute force like strangulation, stabbing, shooting, and other types of serious physical violence, women are far more likely to use poison, suffocation, or medical manipulation. They kill through care or trust, as nurses, caregivers, or wives. They often target people they know, spouses, elderly patients, or children. And because their killings don't always leave blood or broken glass behind, they're less likely to raise an alarm early on. Some of the most prolific female serial killers in history, like Nanny Doss, Marion Cotton, or Janine Jones, used poison or pharmaceuticals over long periods, masking murder as natural death. And because these methods leave fewer obvious clues, many female serial killers may have remained undetected longer, sometimes killing dozens before anyone suspects a pattern and waking up to the fact that there are multiple dead people around one woman. In fact, some research believe the number of female serial killers is undercounted, because many cases are classified as neglect, medical error, or unexplained. So yes, Aileen Wuornos is a really rare case of a female serial killer. Not because she was a woman who killed in itself, but because she killed the way men do, with a gun, up close, on the roadside, and in broad daylight. She just didn't fit the mold, which is part of why the media and the justice system just couldn't look away. When sketches of the two women were released to the public, thousands of calls flooded in, and one tip changed everything. The names, Wuornos and Moore, both were known in the Daytona area as drifters, lovers, were frequenting biker bars. And so the manhunt began. Once again, there was a sense of panic in Florida with a serial killer on the loose, because everyone uses the highways and felt a sense of connection to the case. Undercover officers hit the bars along Daytona's beach strip, looking for a woman who matched Aileen's description. One of them, Mike Joyner, spotted her first. She was playing pool at the Last Resort bar with a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. She was loud, unpredictable, and drunk. Joyner befriended her, buying her drinks and cigarettes, earning her trust. Then, when she agreed to party with him, officers moved in. On January 9th, 1991, at the Last Resort biker bar, just a few weeks shy of her 35th birthday, Aileen Wuornos was arrested. Police described a sense of relief. They believed they'd stopped a serial offender who would have kept killing indefinitely. The day after Eileen's arrest, police tracked down her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, nearly 900 miles away. Tyria was roughly 4 years younger than Aileen and had fled the state after the murders began making headlines. Investigators flew her back to Florida and had set her up in a motel room under police supervision. For 3 days, she made 13 recorded phone calls to Aileen. On those phone calls, she cried and said police were blaming her, that she was scared and might be arrested. Aileen told her again and again, "You don't have to worry, Ty. I'll take the blame. You didn't do anything." And that's exactly what happened. Aileen fell for it immediately. Within days, Aileen confessed to all 7 murders. At first, she claimed each killing was self-defense, that she'd been assaulted or threatened by the men. Later, she'd said it was also about robbery, survival in her words. When asked why she kept killing, she said, "With each one, the rage got worse." And to really understand how Aileen got there, you have to go back to the beginning. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29th in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a 16-year-old mother named Diane. And when Aileen was just 6 months old, Diane abandoned her and her brother, Keith, who was just 11 months older than Aileen, because Diane was unable to raise them. Eileen's biological father was 20-year-old Leo Dale Pittman, who was later convicted of intimate acts with young girls, including the kidnapping and assault of a 7-year-old. He later died by his own hands in prison in 1969. At age 4, Aileen and Keith were officially adopted by their maternal grandparents. But raised might be a too generous word here, because both grandparents were alcoholics, and Eileen's upbringing was chaotic, deeply abusive, and awful. Her grandfather, Laurie, was a violent alcoholic who beat her regularly. And according to later allegations, the abuse may have gone far beyond physical violence. There were claims of forced intimate acts within the family, not only directed at Aileen, but also before that at her mother Diane years ago. It was a family and house steeped in generational trauma, where the violence didn't start with Aileen, but it didn't stop with her either. Her grandfather seemed to hate Aileen and allegedly repeatedly told her that she was a mistake, shouldn't have been born, and was of no worth, and would also punish Aileen by locking her in his homemade sauna and turning up the heat until she screamed. So from a young age on, Aileen really learned that she could neither trust or rely on anyone and basically had to depend on her own. By age 11, Aileen was trading her body and certain types of acts, favors, to say, for cigarettes and food. By 13, Aileen was pregnant after being assaulted. In March 1971, Aileen gave birth to a baby boy that was taken away from her and put up for adoption on the order of the grandfather. Some reports say the father was a friend of her grandfather's, some family acquaintance, rather than explicitly saying it was the grandfather himself. But I wasn't really able to find 100% confirmation online who was the person that perpetrated the assault and got Aileen. Nevertheless, this whole thing really reinforces the idea of her being worthless, and that people that are supposed to love her, protect her, and support her will hurt her. Love in Eileen's life means pain. Then her grandmother died of liver failure from years of alcohol abuse. And instead of Aileen being able to have some time to grieve her grandmother's death, she got blamed. Her grandfather turned his anger toward her as if she somehow was responsible for it all. And this tragic example really reminded me of the psychological concept of scapegoating. It's when parents or caregivers focus all their rage, blame, and emotional dysfunctions on one child, so that the child basically becomes the symbolic and emotional outlet for everything that's wrong in the family, in the home, and also with the emotions of the parents or adults themselves. They're essentially absorbing the emotional burden of the entire family. The scapegoat child also absorbs blame and anger that would otherwise cause conflict between adults. So the child is blamed for everything that goes wrong and punished more severely, or is isolated, and they become, so to say, the punching bag, emotionally, verbally, and often physically. They are unconsciously chosen to carry the blame for the family's deeper problems, which protects the other members, especially the parents, from really confronting their own issues. The caregivers may not even realize they are redirecting their own unresolved pain, shame, rage onto the child. And this doesn't just happen in theory. In countless documented high-profile cases, including the heartbreaking story of Gabriel Fernandez in 2013 and Anthony Avalos in 2018, one child becomes disproportionately the sole target and is systematically singled out for punishment, while other siblings are treated entirely differently and are spared. Tragically, some of these cases don't just leave emotional scars. They end in the worst possible outcome: death, either at the hands of abusers or by the victim's own later on in their lives. Because over time, the scapegoated child may internalize this treatment, believing they are the problem and believing they deserve to be treated this way, which can lead to lifelong issues like low self-worth, anxiety, or destructive behavior. If you found this video compelling so far, please give it a like, and if you're into true crime, please consider subscribing to my channel, Deep, Dark, and Scary. And after the death of Aileen's grandmother, she was kicked out of the house by her grandfather at just 14 years old. From that point on, she was completely on her own, homeless, abandoned, and surviving by any means necessary. She began living in the woods behind their neighborhood, sleeping in abandoned cars, drinking peppermint schnapps to just stay warm, and selling her body for food and sometimes shelter. And I have to say, whatever you think, or we all collectively think of the horrific acts that Aileen committed later in her life, there's just no denying that her early years were just a brutal and really heartbreaking ordeal, marked by rejection, fear, starvation, violence, and emotional devastation. Aileen grew up learning that violence equals power, and that in order to survive, you had to hurt others before they could hurt you. Like many trauma survivors, she lived in a state of chronic alertness that made her everyday life feel like a battlefield. Her nervous system was basically stuck in overdrive and constantly scanning for threats, even when there were none. This psychological pattern is often linked to something that's called preemptive aggression, and more broadly falls under the umbrella of complex trauma responses, particularly in individuals like Aileen with a history of childhood abuse or neglect. Hypervigilance is officially recognized as one of the core symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in clinical psychology. It's the mind's way of saying, I can't ever let my guard down again, or I might die. And it's not just paranoia, it's basically the brain's learned survival response, stuck in the on position after trauma. When someone learns through repeated trauma that people will inevitably hurt them, they may develop a belief that the only way to survive is to strike first. And this is not just emotional, it can become literally wired into the nervous system through prolonged exposure to unsafe environments. Psychologically, the individual perceives threat even in completely normal and neutral day-to-day situations and acts aggressively to regain control before being victimized once again, because they're basically stuck in experience and see the world solely through the lens of when they were traumatized and hurt deeply. This mindset is often rooted in early relational trauma, especially when the person was powerless as a child and learned that the only way to avoid pain and survive was to dominate or destabilize others first. It's commonly seen in survivors of complex PTSD, but also attachment disorders or borderline personality disorder. In itself, it's not a disorder, it is basically just a strategy that once kept a person alive. And to my mind also comes that many trauma experts and therapists also say that people can become emotionally stuck at the age when their first major trauma occurred. And while this isn't a formal clinical diagnosis or a fact in itself, it is a widely observed psychological phenomenon. When trauma happens at a young age, especially repeatedly like in Aileen's life, the brain may freeze certain emotional coping mechanisms at that exact age, leading to regression or emotional reactivity that mirrors the developmental stage at which the trauma occurred. The only person that Aileen at that point in her life was still close with was her brother Keith. But even that was a toxic relationship because of the alleged intimate acts that may have happened between them. At age 16, during the depths of Michigan's freezing and cold winter, Aileen hitchhikes west to Colorado and warmer climates, where she was 2 years later arrested for the first time for driving under the influence and disorderly conduct that involved shooting a gun. By her early 20s, around 1976, Aileen was hitchhiking through the South, mostly drifting around Florida. During that time, she quickly married a 69-year-old man named Louis Gratz Fell, who was a wealthy Florida retiree and president of a yacht club. But just weeks after their wedding, Louis filed for a restraining order, alleging that Aileen had assaulted him multiple times and was violent towards him. Around the same time, her life spiraled further. She spent the following years in and out of jail, charged with theft, assault, disorderly conduct, and transactional relationships. That same year, her brother Keith died of throat cancer at just 20 years old. Aileen received a $10,000 life insurance payout following his death, but she burned through it very quickly, spending it on motel stays, alcohol, cigarettes, and a temporary escape from her unstable reality. Some reports suggest that once the money ran out, Aileen tried to maintain that lifestyle, allegedly fueling her decision to begin robbing and eventually killing the men she encountered. But we don't really know if that was the case or if she has started killing way earlier in her life. That same year, their grandfather, the one who had abused and ultimately kicked her out as a teen, died at his own hands. And with her grandfather gone, she had lost the last remaining thread of family. However broken it had been, it was the final unraveling. Everything familiar, even painful, had now disappeared. Her entire adult life would be spent in motion. No safety net, no stability, no real support. And over the next decade, her rap sheet would grow. DUIs, assault, battery, robbery, threatening and pulling a gun on strangers and her clients. Aileen wasn't just surviving anymore. She was spiraling out of control and towards something much darker. In 1986, Aileen met a woman named Tyria Moore, and it was a turning point in her life. Aileen developed deep emotional feelings for her and believed they were soulmates. She dreamed of spending the rest of her life with her. They were both outspoken, fiery, and fiercely attached to each other. To keep that relationship and to support the lifestyle they shared, Aileen went back to the streets. She wanted to provide for Tyria, to give her the kind of life she thought she deserved, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process. Psychologists who later studied Aileen would confirm her state of mind and described her as a woman who, shaped by lifelong trauma, a child of neglect, abandonment, and violence, who grew into an adult constantly on the edge, expecting betrayal at every turn. Court psychiatrists diagnosed her with borderline and antisocial personality disorders, layered with post-traumatic stress from years of a certain type of abuse and physical violence. To them, her killings weren't just about money or revenge. They were the eruption of rage from someone who had spent her entire existence surviving in a world she believed was determined to destroy her. And according to several specialists, Aileen Wuornos' crimes were linked to both her psychopathic traits and to the severe psychological trauma she experienced throughout her life. When assessed using the Hare psychopathy checklist, she scored 32 out of 40 points, surpassing the typical cutoff score at 30 used to diagnose psychopathy. By the time she was caught, Aileen wasn't just a murderer. She was the product of decades of pain, mistrust, and emotional collapse. Aileen, surprisingly, was ever only tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, the first victim. It was the most defensible case and also the most complicated one. Mallory had a criminal record for assaults, which supported Aileen's claim that she killed him in self-defense. But the jury just didn't buy it. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Afterward, she pled guilty to the 5 more murders to avoid any further trials. She simply refused to even contest them, saying she was tired of the games. When her former girlfriend, Tyria Moore, testified against her, Aileen was devastated. She truly believed they were a team and she was protecting her. And now the woman she called her soulmate and the love of her life had helped send her to death row. She said later, "Ty was my one and only. I'd have done anything for her, and I still would." After the trial, Tyria disappeared from public life. She changed her name, moved north, and has never spoken publicly again. Some believe she was more involved, knew more than she was letting on, maybe even helped pawn stolen items. Others think she manipulated Aileen from the start, but there was not much proof of either. After her sentencing, Eileen's story was far from over, at least not in the courtroom. She filed multiple appeals, arguing that her first trial had been unfair, that the court had refused to hear evidence of her lifelong abuse, and that her lawyer had failed her completely. And she wasn't wrong about that last part. Her public defender, Steve Glazer, a man she mockingly called Dr. Legal, wasn't just representing her in court. He was also cutting side deals with the media, selling interviews, and negotiating television rights while she was sitting on death row. In Florida, that's a direct violation of legal ethics, as I guess it should be. A lawyer cannot profit from a client's case, but did it anyway. He even arranged paid TV appearances featuring himself, and then Eileen's proclaimed adoptive mother, Arlene Prowl, who had also jumped into the media circus claiming she had been called by God to save Eileen's soul. And then British filmmaker Nick Broomfield became one of the very few people to gain access to Aileen in prison. During her appeals, he was documenting her story across 2 films, Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer from 1992, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer from 2003. And I highly recommend watching those. I think they're actually on YouTube. And he ended up exposing the entire operation and the shocking web of conflicts of interest surrounding it. In his first 1992 documentary, the lawyer, the adopted mother, and even local law enforcement officers, which is just unbelievable to me, were trying to exploit the case for personal financial gain. Aileen also accused her lawyers, the police, and even later on the state of Florida of conspiring to profit off her story. And disturbingly, parts of that were actually true. Through his interviews, Broomfield uncovered that while Aileen was still awaiting trial and the investigation was barely wrapped, several law enforcement officers, including high-ranking members of the Marion County Sheriff's Office, were already discussing and negotiating potential book and movie deals while the case was basically still active, which is unbelievable to me. Like, how is this ethically okay? And Nick's film exposed recorded phone calls where one officer was heard saying, "Let's make sure we get paid before the Hollywood people come in." So these revelations obviously caused public outrage and forced the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to briefly investigate the allegations. Though no one was ultimately charged, one of the officers at least was forced to resign. And these instances weren't like proof of a total corruption of the case, but it definitely confirmed what Aileen would scream about for years to come, that people were trying to make money off her. For her, that was validation. And for the public and the victims' families, it was a serious stain on the investigation in the entire case. Eileen's appeals went nowhere. The courts dismissed her claims, the media moved on, and Aileen became even more paranoid, convinced that everyone from her lawyer to the police had sold her out. And surely the media circus and police corruption would add later to Eileen's mental unraveling in her final years and later decline. Aileen, in prison, swung between lucidity and paranoia, between clarity and chaos. After her sentencing, Aileen spent more than 10 years on death row at Florida State Prison. She rarely slept, and she also stopped eating some days, claiming the prison food was contaminated. She had also accused the guards of hypnotizing her through the vents, and interviewers described her alternating states as terrifying and heartbreaking. One moment she was lucid and remorseful, the next ranting about spaceships and Satan. Some days she'd give calm, coherent interviews. Other days she'd spiral into furious rants about being framed, physically hurt, and silenced. And her delusions just grew darker because Aileen was really losing her grip on reality. She claimed the prison staff were physically hurting her with sonic waves through the walls and said that she could feel her brain being burned and that the TV and mirrors were rigged to manipulate her thoughts and that she was being controlled by satellites. So I guess she just lost it. It's quite the unraveling. And Aileen also claimed that the government was trying to drive her insane before taking her life with a death penalty. No evidence supported those claims, but they definitely painted a picture of a woman completely detached from reality and her mind unraveling, isolated, betrayed, and at this point consumed by serious delusions. In her final days, Aileen Wuornos refused spiritual counsel. Aileen told reporters she'd already made peace with God and that she didn't need anyone's forgiveness. She called her victims evil men and believed divine justice would take care of them. On October 9th, 2002, at 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She was 46 years old. Witnesses said she was calm, almost detached. In her last statement, she said, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock. And I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back, I'll be back." Those were her final words. Outside, for reporters and onlookers, it was a spectacle. The end of one of America's most infamous killers. Inside, officers who'd spent years on the case described it differently. They said she clearly lost her mind. One investigator later said, "We executed a person who was mad, and I don't really know what kind of message that gives." Nick Broomfield's second film from 2003, Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, released after her execution, is a much more personal and psychological portrait. Broomfield had returned to Florida revisiting the case through the lens of Aileen's final years on death row. He conducted her final interviews, capturing her mental deterioration, her paranoia, and her last words about the system, God, and betrayal. It showed that just nearly everyone around Aileen was making money off her story, and Aileen saw that too. She told Broomfield on camera, "I was used for money, books, movies, ladder climbs, elections. I lost my life for it." And there definitely are contested and disturbing aspects of her execution. In the case of Aileen Wuornos, the question of whether she was mentally competent to be executed was one of the most contested and disturbing aspects of her death sentence. And it continues to fuel debate to this day. In her final interviews, she shifted erratically between defiance, paranoia, and conspiracy theories. Despite her mental state, the Florida courts found her competent to be executed. Her lawyers filed motions to halt the execution, citing severe mental illness and delusional thinking. But under U.S. law, competency to be executed is a very narrow standard. If the person understands that they are going to be executed and understands why, they can be deemed competent, even if they are severely mentally ill. And the court ruled that Aileen met this threshold. Critics of her execution, including Broomfield and multiple legal observers, argued that she was clearly not sane in any meaningful way when she was put to death in 2002. She had no appeals left, but she also refused legal help. She told the courts she wanted to go ahead with the execution. Some believe this was less about rational decision-making and more about the ideation of dying and paranoia driving her towards a state-sanctioned death. And it's alleged that there were no proper psychiatric stays or in-depth evaluations in the final months. The process moved very quickly, and the execution went ahead despite serious concerns. And I think most people can probably agree that Aileen very likely suffered from serious mental illness in her final years. But the law didn't require her to be mentally healthy, only legally aware of her punishment. So the state moved forward, and her execution remains a disturbing example of the gap between legal standards and psychiatric reality, and a flashpoint in the broader debate over executing mentally ill individuals on death row. Let me know what you think about this, because I know that there are a lot of people that are completely against the death penalty, and I see the points. I personally rather tend to believe that whatever gives the victims' families the most justice and resolve to the crimes that have been committed against their loved ones, I'm good with that. So I think for me, it's just like whatever they decide should happen. But I do think this example really reframes the entire discussion around death penalty and puts it in a different light if you have mental illness involved, in a sense. So let me know what you think about this topic in the comments. And over the years, people have debated whether Aileen was evil or just a byproduct of the world that she was forced to grow up in. Some investigators have even wondered if 1989 really was the beginning. She'd been on the road selling her body and hitchhiking for nearly 2 decades before her first confirmed murder. And who's to say there were really only 7 victims? And all within just 1 year? Killers rarely emerge fully formed overnight. Violence like this usually escalates over time, and most of the times over their entire lives. And considering how many years Aileen spent hitchhiking, drifting, and surviving off the highways, it's hard not to wonder if there were others. Men who all over the country vanished long before anyone knew her name. And in one early police interview, she hinted, "There's guys you never found out west back when I was younger." Do you, like me, think there probably must have been more victims out there, or do you believe that these 7 were the only ones that she targeted? And Aileen would later deny her own claims, saying she was just trying to sound tough. But the timeline fits a classic serial escalation, sudden outbursts after years of silence. Police quietly looked into missing men along the I-10 and I-75 dating back to the 70s. But no physical evidence ever tied her to any earlier cases. But many detectives still believe she'd snapped long before her time in Florida. Other people focused on Aileen's victim pattern. All middle-aged men, all traveling alone. All symbols of safety, money, and control. Everything she'd never had. Each represented power she couldn't access, so she took it from them. And with every new victim, her violence escalated. 6 shots, 9 shots, 12, as if the rage inside her was expanding faster than she could contain it. Then there's the question of Tyria Moore. The woman Aileen called her wife. Tyria was the only one person she ever truly loved. Every dollar Aileen allegedly made went to keep their small world afloat: motel rooms, beer, food, cigarettes. Aileen said Ty made her feel human. During the investigation and trial, Tyria only spoke to law enforcement and testified briefly in court. Her testimony was factual and restrained, and confirmed that Aileen had confessed the murders to her. After the trial, Tyria refused all documentary and press requests. Even filmmakers like Nick Broomfield, who interviewed nearly everyone connected to the case, couldn't get her to appear on camera. And after the trial, Tyria disappeared completely. In later years, public records indicate she changed her name and moved out of state, reportedly to Ohio or Pennsylvania, where she has lived quietly, avoiding all publicity. To this day, she's never publicly spoken about Aileen again. Some believe she knew more, that she'd helped pawn stolen property, maybe even encouraged the robberies. Others think she manipulated Aileen entirely, steering her into danger while staying clean herself. And then there's a softer view, that Tyria was a survivor, swept up in the world she couldn't control. And when she saw the chance to escape, she took it. And whatever the truth is, one fact remains. Aileen never stopped loving her. Even on death row, she said, "I'd do anything for Ty. I still would." And then there's another theory, not about conspiracies or accomplices, but about failure. Because Aileen's story isn't just about 7 murders. It's about how a broken system created a killer. She was born into abuse, abandoned as a baby, violated as a child, expelled at 14 and homeless before she ever even had a chance. There were social service reports, school interventions, arrests, psychiatric evaluations, but no real or long-term help. And surely, by the time that Aileen picked up a gun, she had already been failed endless times. And in the years since, the story of Aileen Wuornos has only grown larger. Movies, documentaries, books, and endless debates. And maybe the real tragedy isn't that Aileen became a monster, but that the world looked at her suffering, her rage, her spiral, and the brutal crimes committed on her victims and turned it into a spectacle. Not a warning, not a lesson, just sensationalized content. In 2003, Charlize Theron stepped into one of the most sterling transformations of her career to play Aileen in the film Monster. Theron gained weight, wore dentures, let her hair and skin age visibly. She became unrecognizable. But her performance earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress at the '76 Oscars, marking a career pivoting. Critics wildly praised Theron's performance. Rotten Tomatoes reports a rating of 82% for the film, with the critical consensus stating Charlize Theron gives a searing, de-glamorized performance as real-life serial killer Aileen Wuornos. Legendary critic Roger Ebert went further, calling her role one of the greatest performances in the history of cinema. Still, the film did not escape controversy. Some people who knew Wuornos criticized Monster for portraying her too sympathetically, and for casting the victims she killed, as one-dimensional villains. Theron herself admitted to having doubts about the role, acknowledging how far removed she felt from the character she was about to embody. But director Patty Jenkins convinced her she was the only person who could do it. It definitely elevated Theron's career, but also refracted the legacy of the case, showing how cinema can reshape, revive, or even rewrite history. And it also made me think of how courtrooms nowadays more and more basically become studios. Because in today's media landscape, courtrooms don't always feel like places of justice anymore, but have been turned into real-life studios. Cases aren't only prosecuted anymore, they are basically being produced. And the Aileen Wuornos case was one of those early warning signs. The rights to her story were sold and resold while the investigations were still going on. Lawyers and guardians negotiated access, filmmakers rolled cameras even before the trial had finished. Her life and crimes and the lives of the victims basically became media property. The story of her committing these brutal murders a pitch. And now this seems to be becoming, if it not already is, the norm. I mean, we all watched it happen during the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. You know, what used to be headlines turned into the live streams, and millions of people watched the legal battles between them play out live on TV or the internet, on YouTube every day, like it was some sort of a reality show. Clips went viral, memes were made that ruled the conversation about legal proceedings. And a verdict wasn't just handed down in court, it was handed down every hour, every day in the comment sections and internet forums. And in an environment like this, there's definitely a part where serious criminal cases and the act of seeking justice for victims becomes numb entertainment. And I also think we always have to keep in mind when we watch or create content like this, that these are not just stories, but they're real cases and they're real people behind these stories. They're real victims, they're real families of victims that are still out there and around with real feelings and emotions. And I think we really have to be conscious of the fact that these are serious, raw tragedies and crimes committed against people, and their lives often ended in the most horrific ways. So I think, in a way, when retelling or talking about cases, I think there needs to be some sort of respect. I mean, surely one can argue where that line is crossed or not. And that actually reminds me also of Netflix, because when they released the Jeffrey Dahmer series, several victims' families came forward saying they were never notified nor consulted and were horrified while having to watch actors reenact their loved ones' murders, not as part of a legal record, but as basically primetime drama. They called it re-traumatizing and exploitative. And honestly, they weren't wrong. These are not abstract stories. They're the worst moments in someone's life, packaged for binge watching. So I do think one has to really ask themselves, when we re-examine Aileen Wuornos now through documentaries, podcasts, or dramatizations, are we really trying to understand what happened and maybe how we potentially can prevent the same thing happening again to other people in the future? Or are we just telling these cases through just the killer's lens and barely even mention the victims and their remaining families? And I will also say from personal experience, it's often very difficult to find detail and information about the victims in these cases. I think I was really able to do that in my Fred and Rosemary West video. Because there was a lot of information out there on the many victims and really heartbreaking stories. But sometimes that's not possible. I try to find information about the victims here, and sometimes there's just nothing much you can find. So in a lot of cases, there's just really very little publicly available information about who the victims really were, what they did, or how their families remember them, and what their dreams were. I mean, not that that would change anything, I guess, about the fact that some families don't ever want to hear about it again and just let it lie and let it rest. So it's difficult. I think it's a difficult topic around true crime. And if I see a family that doesn't want their loved one mentioned in a case, I would never even talk about it. I left one of the victims out in one of my Austin Lady Bird Lake cases, which is also, these cases are, not unsolved officially, but, so the theory goes. And there was one family that really didn't believe in the conspiracies and didn't want their loved one mentioned. So I completely respect that. I would never want to, intrude in that sense and open wounds. But definitely the silence makes it much harder to present the full human impact of what really has happened. And that's why I think it's so important to stay mostly grounded in the facts of the cases, what happened, how it happened, and how to kind of avoid glorifying the killer, which unfortunately still happens far too often in true crime coverage. And Aileen's case isn't the only one. We've seen this especially back in the day with male serial killers like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and even today, it's still happening in the Brian Koberger case, I feel. And, some of these serial killers, they have done the worst possible acts, but they're still being romanticized and repackaged into pop culture. I just feel it really crosses ethical lines in a sense when reporting about a topic or talking about a topic like this in public. And, it's something that we've also seen in school shooting cases as well, where the media focuses so much on the shooter instead of the victims that it actually inspires copycats. And I think that imbalance is really dangerous. True crime storytelling has a responsibility not just to inform, but to also center the right voices. When we lose complete sight of that, we risk turning real tragedies into just entertainment and basically giving the wrong people the spotlight. I do believe, while I'm saying that in the Aileen Wuornos case, it's really important to explain her upbringing and the abuse and neglect that she actually has been going through, because it seems like it's directly correlated to why she committed certain crimes. So I would never want to leave the facts of the case out. And my heart breaks for her when she was young, and obviously also for the victims, that their lives were taken randomly for nothing. It's, some of these cases are just really, really rough and sad and heartbreaking. And in the end, when you strip away the headlines and the horror, what's left is a woman who was abandoned by everyone and who finally turned that abandonment and the rage outward in the worst possible way. Was Aileen born evil or just raised unwanted, abused, and neglected? And every system that should have saved a young Aileen simply looked away. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. I do think it's an important discussion to be had around true crime. And obviously, while none of this excuses what she did, 7 people died brutally, and their families live with that pain forever. But I do think Aileen Wuornos remains one of the rare killers whose story forces us to look not just at the crime, but at what created it and what society, institutions, systems, and maybe all of us can do to potentially prevent and help children and young people from going down a certain path. Would it work 100% of the time? No, probably not. But at least I do think the discussion around it is worth a try. And as a society, don't we also have to ask how many children right now are living through the same trauma that Aileen had to endure? abandoned, abused, starved, unsupported. Like, how many of them are being failed in real time while you're watching this and I'm sitting here? And what could we do to prevent this in the future? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching Deep, Dark, and Scary. If you want to see more stories like this, please consider subscribing, like this video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next upload. And I wish you a happy Halloween this weekend.